Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So here we are to do a review of my new rapier. I showed you this before Christmas and I've had quite a few questions about it since then. You'll notice I'm handling the blade. I'll just quickly mention something about that because it comes up quite a lot in recent videos about people, you're touching your blade, you're touching your blade. Quite simply, so long as you know you've touched your blade, and if you touch it regularly, there's actually not a problem. Where the real problem lies is touching blades, making them excessively wet or sweaty, and then sticking them away in a bag or in their scabbard or on the wall and leaving that residue there. If your hands are fairly dry or fairly grease-free like mine, actually if you handle steel regularly, it really doesn't oxidise to any noticeable extent because you already kind of rub off any sort of beginnings of oxidization before it really sets in. It's really with swords that you don't handle very often. But the general rule is if you know you've touched a blade, and I will do this after this video, I'll just rub this down with a cloth, with a rag. A bit of oil wouldn't do any harm, a bit of ballast oil for example, WD-40 if you haven't got ballast oil. But anyway, on to the review of the sword. So, quite correctly, as a number of you have pointed out, it is a relatively unusual design. I am the kind of person that likes to do things a bit differently to other people. Yeah, I basically wanted something that wasn't the same as everybody else's rapiers. Lots of people have got cup hilt rapiers these days. Some of you who are my regular viewers will know I have certain feelings about cup hilts. I think it's a bit wrong to use a cup hilt for a rapier system, or even a regional style or a regional kind of tendency when a cup hilt wouldn't have been used. I think that, you know, cup hilts give you an advantage for hand protection, and I didn't want an unfair advantage. I thought, well, if I'm going to be using a rapier, let's say of the early to mid 17th century in England, I probably won't have a cup hilt, so I don't want to use a cup hilt. I want to know what it's like to use a, let's call it a swept hilt. Okay, it's a form of swept hilt. That is, it's made up of bars. Now, that is exactly what this is. This is an English style swept hilt from about the 1630s, 1640s. So we're looking at the period of the English Civil War. That's an interesting period of history, of course. It's relatively late in the history of the rapier. The rapiers are what we'd really call rapiers as opposed to side swords. These are fairly subjective terms. A side sword has more like a cut and thrust, more of a kind of broadsword blade, and a rapier has more of a thrusting blade. But really where you draw the line between side sword and rapier is a very subjective thing. And as I've mentioned in previous videos, back in period, back in the 16th century, they just called swords essentially either, of this sort anyway, either a sword or a rapier. And we really don't know where they drew the line. And this is specifically in England as well. We know that we had what were known as tucks, rapiers and swords. For example, if we look at Joseph Swetnam's treatise of 1617, he sometimes refers to swords, short swords, long swords and rapiers. When he says longsword, he's not talking about what we would call a longsword, that being a hand and a half sword or a bastard sword. He's actually talking about a long one-handed sword. So what's the difference between a long sword and a rapier? We don't exactly know. Probably, and this is my guess, what he meant when he said rapier was a really thrust-centric sword like this. And what he meant when he said long sword was essentially something broader than this, that had some cutting capacity and had a blade which was more choppy and a little bit less nimble in the point. But it's a very subjective thing. So this is an English rapier specifically, and I modelled it on two surviving examples in the Wallace collection. For a number of reasons. I have a strong personal connection to the Wallace collection. As many of you will know, I've done videos towards the end of last year with Tobias Capel, the curator of Arms and Armour there, who I've known for many years. I've also been going to the Wallace collection since I was a teenager, and I have I really love that collection. I've kind of grown up with it. So, and the other reason, of course, is because whilst I don't live in London anymore, I work in London and I go into London all the time, and I can quite easily visit the Wallace collection and see these swords. So it felt right to have a rapier that was modelled on something that an original that I can see and I can visit and I'm familiar with and all of this kind of stuff. Additionally, the English Civil War is an interesting period. As I mentioned, in terms of rapiers, it's fairly late in the development of rapiers. Rapiers really start to grow out of side swords, if we want to call them that, in, let's say, around the middle of the 16th century, the kind of 1550s 1560s, where, and in that period between about 1550 and about 1570, the really long slender blades on essentially slightly more developed side sword hilts start to become more prevalent, and rapiers, what we would call rapiers, start to become more common than side swords, at least in Italy. We should note, of course, that in England rapiers were essentially a gentleman's civilian sidearm. They weren't primarily weapons of war. Now that's not to say they weren't carried in war, they absolutely were. Just in the same way that small swords, for example, were carried by gentlemen officers in the 18th century, for example in the American War of Independence, or indeed the wars of Clive of India in India in the mid-18th century. Officers did wear small swords in the 18th century, and officers did wear rapiers in the 16th and 17th century. And they were used in war sometimes. They were used by both people on horse and on foot, with varying success, and there are certain types of rapier that we are probably a bit more warlike, that have bigger, beefier blades on them and usually simpler hilts. The more ornate rapiers and the more slender rapiers tend to be, we assume, more civilian-centric. So this is more or less a civilian rapier of the mid-17th century, but there's nothing preventing it from being carried in war by an officer. Remember that their primary weapon wouldn't necessarily be their sidearm, wouldn't be their sword. Their primary weapon would probably be, whether it's someone on foot, their primary weapon might be a musket, or if they're on horse, their primary weapon might be a brace of pistols. The sword is really a backup. It is a weapon of self-defense primarily, actually. Okay, so but in civilian life this would have been used, this type of sword would have been used in duels, it would have been used in self-defense. It wasn't the specialised dueling weapon that the small sword was. This was really taken to the extreme of development for dueling only, pretty much, dueling and wearing. The difference with the rapier, of course, and I'll talk more about this in a future video, is that the rapier had to be able to fight against all sorts of other swords, including back swords, broadswords, you know, Highland basket-hilted broadswords, potentially even long swords, even two-handed swords, spears, halberds, partisans, glaives, all sorts. So this weapon had to be bigger and beefier and longer to deal with those potential threats, and it was very often used generally in Europe with a rapier, with a dagger as its companion weapon in the left hand. That's not to say that that was the only companion weapon for the rapier. The rapier was additionally sometimes used with the buckler, sometimes used with a cloak, and sometimes used with sort of random other objects. But in England specifically, it seems that there was quite a tendency to use the rapier by itself, and it does seem that maybe in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands, this was quite popular as well. There are certain advantages to not using an offhand weapon. Generally speaking, someone with a rapier and dagger has an advantage over someone with just a rapier. However, one advantage with not having an offhand weapon is that you present only one side forward, and much like in sabre, so you're making yourself a narrower target and getting a longer reach. As soon as you bring an offhand weapon into play, this side of your body comes forward and you're presenting a squarer target and a bigger target. But back to the review of the sword. I love to go off on tangents. So actually I don't have a colossal number of things to say about this sword. It's really great. It's from Marco Danelli of Danelli Armouries. And for a long time I have recommended people who want to get rapiers to go to Marco. I'm not primarily a rapierist. I'm primarily a practitioner of Fiore, longsword and dagger mostly, and of 19th century military sabre, of course, Victorian sabre. However, I do dabble in rapier from time to time. And there's a growing interest in my club of people doing rapier, so I thought I may as well get one. As many of you know, I tried to destroy my previous rapier, which was a Hanway Practical with a 43-inch blade, and I was never fond of that rapier. I never really liked it. It was a stopgap. It was something that I could use for when I attended rapier classes, but it was frankly quite horrible to fence with because it had such a floppy blade, and I wanted something with a stiffer blade and, if possible, a nicer hilt. The Hanway hilt was very big and had a very small pommel, and rapiers should have a big pommel to bring the point of balance back, of course. So overall, what have we got? Well, first of all, the weight. It is 1.3 kilograms, which is pretty much on the button. It's very slightly heavier than the original, the primary original example, which I'll picture at the end of this video, that it was based on. So it's close to the original weight. The blade is very slightly shorter than the original. The original has a 43-inch blade, this has a 41-inch blade. I'm absolutely fine with that. A 41-inch blade, for me being used to sabres, this is more manageable for me. Above about 42 inches I struggle to know what to do with all of that blade. It's quite a lot of extra blade and not really necessary. One of the key things about Marco's newest generation of rapier blades is they are made of 8mm thick bar stock, which brings them very close and pretty much the same in thickness to the original rapiers, and that's 8mm. Okay, if you look at a Hamway, it's only about 5 or 6mm, I think. Now that thickness, it does various things. It means you have distal taper, so it goes from 8mm here down to about probably 3mm here. Okay, so you've got a lot of distal taper, which gives you a very nice feeling in the blade. It means the meat of the blade is down here, and it gives you a more nimble tip, essentially. Okay, but that also, of course, is very useful when you're dealing with practice weapons, and this is a blunt. That's why I'm handling the blade so casually. It is a blunt for fencing with. The other advantage, and I hadn't thought of this when I actually ordered this sword, but the other advantage to having an 8mm thick blade is that the tip, and Marco makes the tips like this, so they're not rolled like Reganier's tips, they are essentially ground down, but he leaves material at the end as a sort of button, as a blunt tip. And the advantage is, Marco's blades, which previously I think were about 6mm thick, his blunt ends were not quite blunt enough. Certainly for the Fight Camp Rapier tournaments, I've always elected to have Marco's tips have we use a brass cartridge over the end to bulk up that point, because we found the points were just a little bit too small. However, with an 8mm thick fort, it means we've got an 8mm thick point here because it's ground down from a flat bar, and that is now thick enough and safe enough to be used without a tip over the end of it. So I'm quite satisfied for 8mm blades from Marco to be used without any addition on the end of there in the Fight Camp Rapier tournament, which is great. It means we've now got something that looks nicer, but we've also got something that is lighter at the end and cleaner. It's not going to snag on things, nothing's going to fall off, and it's safe, of course, and I'm pushing that into my palm of my hand. I swear I'm not like hiding pain or anything like that. It is absolutely fine. You'll notice the blade, the way the blade flexes. I'll just grab it at both ends. If I just push from both ends, we've got a stiff first half of the blade, and the flex is all in the second half of the blade. That's what we want, okay? That's really good. And that means when we thrust this into someone, it will flex in a safe way, but still, for binding against blades, we've got a nice stiff blade that won't bend aside in a bind like the Hamway blade would. And I have to say, this summer I played with some darkwood blades, and the darkwood blades are not as thick as this. And I found the darkwood blades a little bit floppy, but more than that, one of the problems was that the recent darkwood blades seem to be a bit on the soft side, and in fact the blade I was using, which unfortunately was a borrowed blade, bent. It bent when I thrust Pier Marco in the chest, which you can see in the videos on this channel. I hit him somewhere in the chest and the blade stuck, the blade flexed, and when it came out it was still bent. And that blade's now not usable at that bent point. As it happens, it was lucky that it was a 45-inch blade. So I actually bought the blade off the chap who I'd borrowed it from, who was very gracious about the whole thing, and I was very apologetic, but I bought the blade off him, and I would actually saw off the bent part and use the rest of the blade, and it still leaves about a 42-inch blade, so it was lucky in that regard. I can still get some use out of that blade, but it was on the soft side, and you don't really want that. Marco's blades have a good reputation for not bending, not getting bent, and just generally for durability. So the blade is fantastic. Just last things to say about it, I had a fuller put in, which really is aesthetic. It can be made cheaper without the fuller, but the fuller just looks really nice. And when you're dealing with a blunt practice blade, blunt blades do have a tendency to be quite boring sometimes and quite kind of flat and dull. So putting a fuller in makes it just a bit more attractive, and it is close to the original. The original has fuller as well. A little detail, a lot of makers, for example Andrea Ferrara or various Solingen makers, put their names in the fuller, and I don't know if you can see that. Just catch it on the light there. There you go, just there you can see Marco has put Danelli, of course Danelli Armouries, in the fuller, just like the original Andrea Ferrara swords, which is awesome. I was really excited when I saw that, because it really gives it a look of an original. Now the hilt, the first big difference between this and the original hilt, and this was always going to be the case, and I decided this, was that it's nowhere near as ornate as the original. The original, as many rapiers in the Wallace collection, they are there and they were chosen by the collector who bought them because they're incredibly ornate. And we knew we could never recreate a practice rapier with that degree of ornamentation. Not to say Marco couldn't do it, I'm sure Marco could do it, but I wasn't willing to spend the amount of money that it would cost to make a rapier that decorative. And it also seems pointless for a rapier that's going to get beaten about in practice and thrown in a kit bag. Okay, I will treat this as well as I can, but it's going to get hit by other swords. I'm not a multi-millionaire yet, unfortunately, but so I couldn't afford a rapier which was that ornate and had, you know, kind of gold leaf and stuff on it, although if I could afford it, I would. So what we did is we essentially took the shape of the hilt, which is exactly like the original, and then we stripped it of the decoration on the surface and made it plain. But we left these roundels on here, which are on the original, but on the original all of these bars are decorated and the roundels are decorated as well. Okay, obviously we couldn't do that, but what I decided to do to make these roundels sort of stand out a bit is have the hilt blacked or blued, depending on what you want to call it. This is actually blacked, it's a very, very dark blue, but have those roundels picked out in polished, in burnished steel colour, the natural steel colour. And all of the elements of the hilt are essentially like the original, which is, as I said, specifically an English design of the 1630s, 1640s. The grip, I elected to have a steel wire wrap, and the reason I went for that is simply because I'm always going to be using this with gloves on. It has to be said, it's not bad at all actually in bare hands, but you will probably work up blisters pretty quickly without gloves on. But given that this rapier is always going to be used for fencing or practice with a glove on, what I wanted was the most amount of traction possible, and this wire kind of grip really bites into the leather glove and gives you a really, really secure grip. Obviously the finger is usually put over the front guard. Yes, I know there are other treatises that talk about putting 2 fingers through and no fingers through and all sorts of stuff, but the conventional way of holding a rapier that is shown most of the time is simply like that, which I'm fine with. The pommel is large, as on the original, and it brings, but surprisingly, it brings the point of balance not that far back. Okay, so the point of balance is only about 4 inches out. The blade length 41 inches, total weight 1300 grams, and it's secured by a locking nut, Marco's standard form of construction, which means that you can take the hilt off, replace the blade, change the hilt, do whatever you like. It's a little bit difficult to tighten. You have to wrap a sort of piece of leather or a piece of rubber around it and then use pliers and tighten it, because it's done round, so it doesn't look like a modern nut. It has a slightly look of the original peen button. So there we go, guys. It's Marco Danelli Armouries rapier, made to order for me, and I'm extremely happy with it, and I'm sure you'll be seeing it in upcoming videos of me trying to use it on people. But thank you for watching. I will be doing some more videos about rapiers coming up very soon. Cheers folks! Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.